Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. I have a few questions today about the Netflix docuseries Tiger King, Murder, Mayhem, and Madness. Could I analyze the mental health and personality factors featured in the series? What about the crimes featured in the documentary? Was Joe Exotic guilty? And did Carole Baskin have something to do with the disappearance of her husband? The people featured in the series, of course, are real people. So just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. So the series has 7 episodes, and it was released in March of 2020. It tracks the stories of several people involved in collecting, buying, selling, exploiting, and protecting exotic animals. It's mostly centered around tigers. Some of the people include Joseph Maldonado-Passage, also known as Joe Exotic, Carole Baskin, a person refers to himself as Doc Antle, and Jeff Lowe. First, I'll go through the timeline of what we see here in the series, and then I'll provide an analysis including the theories about the murder-for-hire plot and the disappearance of Baskin's husband, Don Lewis. So the story takes a number of twists and turns and is actually quite extensive, especially with all the different people who are interviewed. To summarize here, we see Joe Exotic owns a private zoo in Oklahoma, which features a number of tigers. Much of his revenue comes from people who pay to handle the tiger cubs. I couldn't actually believe this was a real business when I saw this, but apparently there are many places that do this. Then we see Carole Baskin. She is the owner of Big Cat Rescue in Florida. She makes it her mission to protect tigers and other animals. As part of her mission, she targets Joe Exotic, as well as a few other zoo operators. She advocates for big cats using social media and other means. Her behavior cuts into Joe's profits. For example, Joe and his staff would travel around to malls and other places with tiger cubs, and Carole stopped them from doing that by contacting the malls and telling them how destructive that could be for the tigers. Now, Joe doesn't take kindly to Carole's behavior. He considers it harassment, and he views Carole as hypocritical, because she also has tigers at her facility and charges people to see them. Joe has an active social media presence. He has like this web-based TV show that he does regularly. He uses this platform to repeatedly ridicule and criticize Carole in a variety of ways. Some of the statements and expressions were particularly derogatory and threatening. It's really amazing he got away with this for so long. He suggested that Carole murdered her husband Don Lewis back in 1997. Her husband did disappear, and I'll talk about that later. He did what I'll loosely refer to as music videos, featuring an actress who looked like Carole feeding what was supposed to be Carole's former husband, Don, to a tiger. On a show, he took a mannequin or some type of doll that was supposed to represent Carole, and he shot it in the head with a revolver. So not only was this, of course, threatening, this was inside a structure, like he fired the gun in a structure. He managed to get a hold of Carole's diary and read it aloud and offered commentary on it. He protested in front of her business, the rescue, and rented a helicopter and flew over top of it. It was really just amazing how much content that he produced in this particular feud with Carole Baskin. Now, as this feud was escalating, Joe took the logo from Carole's Big Cat Rescue, and he created another logo, Big Cat Rescue Entertainment. So, not particularly creative. A trademark and copyright infringement lawsuit followed. Carole and her husband Howard prevailed and were eventually awarded a $1 million settlement. It's actually a little bit more than $1 million. Joe made all of these different legal maneuvers to try to prevent Carole from seizing his assets. He also destroyed some of his assets that she was going to take. There was this mysterious fire in one of his buildings that was never linked to him, but it destroyed a lot of property that Carole would have had access to. And it destroyed these recordings of a reality show that he was doing. During all these legal problems, Joe brought in an investor named Jeff Lowe. He was a convicted felon, and he also had an interest in big cats. Eventually, Jeff became the owner of the zoo, and there were accusations back and forth between Jeff and Joe, and eventually Joe left. Not long after Joe left, he was charged with murder for hire. He had allegedly hired an employee of the zoo, who was loyal to Jeff, to murder Carole Baskin. Joe was eventually convicted of this crime and many other crimes related to his treatment of tigers, including killing 5 tigers. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison. So again, that was just a summary. There was a lot that happened in that series. So now looking at some specific points in the series that I thought were significant. First, I'll look at the personality of the persona observed with Joe Exotic, because of course there's no way to know what he's really like. It could just be an act. We see a number of indications that Joe wanted to be the center of attention. He seemed fascinated with the camera being on him. I was wondering if there was even a minute of his life that wasn't recorded. There was so much footage in that series. He liked public speaking. He had a flair for the dramatic. He seemed a bit eccentric, and he said a lot of things that are inconsistent with good judgment. I will go through a few interesting points that really stood out for me here as I was looking at this series. One of his employees lost her arm in a tiger attack. And as this was happening, right after it happened, Joe walked into the gift shop and told the customers that were standing there that one of his employees had her arm ripped off. There are so many other ways he could have put that. He could have said, there's been an accident, but it's under control. No one else is in danger. Emergency services are handling it. But instead, he had to mention that someone's arm was actually ripped off. During that same incident, he said, I'm never going to financially recover from this, which of course is quite callous given the circumstances. We see they were filming this reality show, and the producer had this idea of putting Joe Exotic on a throne. And later the producer witnessed Joe repeatedly playing back the footage where he was on that throne. So I thought that was interesting as well. He seemed to have an affinity for the irresponsible use of firearms. Joe Exotic took a lot of chances, like when he shot into the air and into the ground when people were standing next to him. One of his husbands, Travis, accidentally killed himself. Evidently, he routinely pointed guns at people. Apparently, he believed that his Ruger semi-automatic pistol would not fire with the magazine removed. Of course, one of the rules of gun safety is always assume a gun is loaded and capable of firing. Also worth noting here, Joe found another partner just 2 months after the death of Travis. Joe made a number of bizarre music videos, but evidently they were not using his voice, right? It was somebody else's voice. I don't think that part was actually mentioned in the series. At one part, he said that the music helps him escape from reality. I remember thinking when he said that one has to arrive someplace before one can escape. Just a thought that occurred to me. He didn't seem to be too good with money. It amazed me that he could actually stay in business and continue to buy pickup trucks, firearms, hire all those people. It's just incredible. He must have had a tremendous cash flow to compensate for what seemed like pretty poor management of that zoo. He maintained awful boundaries with the employees. It was hard to actually identify one thing he did right when looking at him interact with the employees. Like he fired people when he was being recorded for the reality show, I guess to look tough or to look dominating. The show never happened, of course, because of the studio fire. He ran for president of the United States. He ran to be the governor of Oklahoma. I suppose people can say a lot of things about Joe Exotic, but no one can assert that he was boring, right? This guy had an interesting life. In terms of the 5-factor model, so looking at his personality, again, there's no way to be sure because he could be acting, it could all just be a persona. But from what we see in the series, his behaviors are consistent with high openness to experience, low conscientiousness, high extroversion, and probably somewhere around mid-range agreeableness and mid-range neuroticism. This persona appears to have a sense of entitlement. He appears to believe that he's special. There's grandiosity, high self-esteem, a lot of self-confidence, social dominance, and fantasies of being extremely successful. There may be some alignment with the construct of narcissism. The next interesting point from the series deals with Carol Baskin. I'll review 2 aspects here. This theory about her involvement in the disappearance of her husband, Don Lewis, and the idea that what she does was really just as bad as Joe Exotic. Not everything here comes from the series. I'll put all the references I used in the description for this video. First, the disappearance. Joe Exotic asserted many times that Baskin killed Don Lewis. So Carol was married to a man named Don Lewis. They owned a sanctuary for exotic cats in Tampa, Florida. Don Lewis disappeared on August 18, 1997, and was never seen again. The case is actually not considered a murder. It's considered a missing person case. No physical evidence has ever been found. Don's van was found about 40 miles away at an airport, and that's really where the trail goes cold. Baskin claims that Don was exhibiting behavior before his death that was odd, like hoarding behavior and memory problems. Don attempted to file a restraining order about 2 months before his disappearance, but was unsuccessful. Baskin denies she ever made any type of threat. Baskin indicated that she would try to get rid of junk that Don had collected when he was in Costa Rica with another woman, and this led to the restraining order. Then there's this matter of Anne McQueen. She was featured in the series. She was referred to as Don's trusted assistant. Allegedly, she embezzled $600,000 from Don and Carol's company. That wasn't mentioned in the series. Anne claimed that Don gave her a letter saying that she should take it to the police if he disappeared. She didn't mention that until September 9th, 1997. Anne allegedly told Baskin that the reason Don filed the restraining order was to stop Baskin from removing junk from the property. I mentioned that before, so that kind of supports her story. We see the word disappearance was used in the power of attorney. So instead of saying something like death, it said in the event of disappearance. This was emphasized in the series as being unusual, and it actually is quite unusual. Baskin allegedly asked for this wording because Don dealt with shady, mafia-like characters in Costa Rica. So what are my thoughts here about Carol Baskin's innocence or guilt? So I'll look at the evidence pointing toward guilt and the evidence pointing toward innocence. So pointing toward guilt, really there's not much. Having your husband disappear without a trace is an unusual occurrence. The wife would be the first person who is suspected. The word disappearance in that power of attorney is odd, even though there was an explanation for it. Pointing toward innocence, well, just about everything else. There was no body parts, no physical evidence whatsoever. Don was having an affair with a woman in Costa Rica. That's a risky venture. Just that alone puts a person at a greater risk for something bad happening. On top of this, when Don would travel to Costa Rica, he met with those shady business partners. This certainly increases the chances of not living anymore as well. He owned aircraft and had an interest in flying. This offers an explanation of how he might have managed to disappear. The van was located far from the residence at that airport, as I mentioned. It would have been difficult for Carol to have placed that van there and then got back to her residence. It would have involved somebody seeing her or an accomplice, and there's no evidence that either one of those things occurred. Don allegedly told one of his friends that he was trying to pull something that would be slick. That seems a little suspect. Don was recently diagnosed with bipolar disorder. This could explain unusual behavior, including impulsivity. As far as I know, Baskin doesn't have any history of criminal activity, none before her husband's disappearance and none after. This would be unusual. It's unusual for somebody to go from no criminal behavior all the way to murder. Now, she did mention throwing a potato at her previous husband, Mike, but I don't know if this really qualifies as a criminal act. So what do I think happened here? Well, I don't think that Baskin had anything to do with this disappearance. It's hard to imagine that she murdered somebody and left no evidence whatsoever. I think it's more likely that he flew an aircraft out of that airport and went over the Gulf of Mexico and crashed. Another possibility is that those contacts in Costa Rica murdered him or had him murdered. Now, the next point related to Baskin. Was she just as bad as Joe? So this was really his argument, that Baskin was in the same business. Well, her business is an exotic rescue, so there is no breeding, no letting the public touch the animals, and there's no buying or selling of animals. What about her relentless pursuit of those exotic zoo operators? Did she push things too far? Well, we saw from the series how these people operate these zoos. I was really shocked at how badly the animals were treated, and really surprised that they could even operate at all. Those businesses could operate at all. I don't really see a problem with her advocating for the tigers. Now, on this point, the series mentioned Baskin sued Joe Exotic's mother and caused her to lose her house, right? On this whole point of maybe that she was pushing things too far. As it turns out, Baskin never asked for any money from Joe Exotic's mother, although Howard and Carol Baskin did sue her because she participated in transferring assets into and out of her name. So it became necessary as part of their first lawsuit against Joe Exotic. The next area. Was Joe Exotic guilty of murder for hire? So I'll give my analysis of this part. In terms of the issue with the animals, like those charges, those seem pretty clear. I'm pretty sure he was guilty of that. But many people have suggested there's more doubt around the murder for hire plot. So the series essentially makes this case that 3 felons were involved in testifying against Joe Exotic. One of them was the alleged hitman, the person that he had hired to kill Carol Baskin. It is suspect that none of these people were charged with any crime. And if it was only their testimony that convicted Joe Exotic, I would see the point. Like we see that Jeff Lowe said in the series that he encouraged Joe. That bothers me a bit. The problem here is that Joe offered $10,000 to an undercover FBI agent to kill Carol Baskin. His defense against these charges, he was just kidding, right? The old, I was just kidding defense. I think in the series, Joe is portrayed as unaware, like he lacked insight. Maybe he did these bad things like threatening Carol Baskin and killing tiger cubs because he was just kind of bouncing along. He really didn't have any ill intent. He was just a nice guy who was a little bit impulsive or unorthodox. He was lovable, harmless, not too smart. He's one of those people you look at and you think people are going to laugh at them, not with them. I think this is why a few celebrities have come forward to support Joe Exotic, right? They see him as naive. Above and beyond what he did to the tigers, which is unacceptable, he tried to hire somebody to kill another human being. I'm inclined to believe he's guilty, and I'm okay with the 22-year sentence. So some closing thoughts here about the Tiger King series. When looking at those people who operated the zoos and committed criminal activities, they seem to have significant manipulation skills. They got people to work for them for limited compensation. The workers lived in terrible conditions. People were really just obsessed with those tiger cubs. It almost seemed like a cult. Some people have asked me specifically about cluster B personality features in these exotic zoo operators. Well, there's no way to know. There's no way to speak specifically about one person. In general terms, some of the zoo operators who were criminals could have had cluster B personality features, right? That would include antisocial features. That would explain some of the criminality. Narcissistic features. It would explain the grandiosity and the fantasies of success, the sense of entitlement. Borderline would explain some of the emotional instability. And histrionic would explain a need to be the center of attention. Now again, there's no way to apply that to any specific person. I'm just talking about in general. That's something that could be happening. Another disorder that was mentioned a few times is substance use disorder. This is also possible. We saw a lot of different substances featured in the series: cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, and of course alcohol. It's actually somewhat concerning that the criminal zoo operators are really hiding in plain sight, yet many people didn't even know they were there. So the series is really helpful in that way. I wasn't happy about some of the inaccuracies in the series, but overall I did like the quality of the production. I know whenever I review mental health and personality characteristics, there will always be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.